This is a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello, welcome to Undistracted. I'm your host, Laura Bennett, and this is the podcast where we learn from our guests how to be better at building our lives with intention around our passions, our purpose, and deal with some of the stuff that can get in the way of that. You can subscribe wherever you're listening, rate this podcast, share it with a friend. It helps people find it. And you can also see video versions of a bunch of these interviews on the Hope 1032 YouTube channel. Our guest today is Elizabeth Green. She has spent her career, her life as a flying doctor. She's also spent much of it as a pediatrician, and her recent book, NoTime for Makeup, takes us into the world of remote care and the unique skills required for it. Let's welcome Elizabeth to the show. Explain to us first up what sort of a typical week in that kind of career involves.
I think it is uncertainty and topsy-turvy and anything else to chuck into it. I mean, it was for me 1988 to 1990, which seems like a long time ago in some ways, but the essence of what I did at that time hasn't really changed. I mean, the innovation and technology might have, but essentially when I worked in Kalgoorlie, which is in the goldfields in Western Australia, I was part of a team of doctors, nurses and pilots, and a typical day would never end up typical. I mean, you could start off in the office in Piccadilly Street and in Kalgoorlie opposite the hospital, and you could do a hospital round of normal patients, normal people, and then you'd get a call. And for me, I was Mobile 7, so I had a radio receiver, and it was like, Mobile 7 over, and I'd take the message, and it might be a child in 1,300 kilometres away in the central desert, north or northeast of Kalgoorlie, and I'd be just told by one of the remote outpost nurses, I have a child here who's 2 or 3, they've got a fever, they're coughing, they're unwell, and you would give advice. This is before telehealth and before COVID. You just had to listen carefully, make the diagnosis, and then you had to administer medication advice over a radio communication and then keep in touch to make sure that that child was okay. And then you had the call. Did you need to go out, or did I need to go out and pick that child up, or could I send a nurse, or did I need to go with a nurse? And generally you tended to go earlier with these kids, and nearly always I would go as a doctor with the nurse because you never knew what was going to happen. So, that could be happening, and you could be about to hop on that aircraft to pick up that child, and then something else might happen. There might be a mine disaster or a rollover on the Transline on the air highway that reaches across the Nullarbor from Kalgoorlie to the South Australian border. And then you might get someone from a station calling. So it was just always go, go, go. And the thing was in a week you would be doing some routine stuff, but then you would be on call. So you might do some routine day clinics where you just flew out for the day to the wheat belt, and you would just see patients in a clinic, and then you would come back, and then you would be called at night to go into the desert to pick up a child who had meningitis. So it was a mixture of things, and every week would change.
What kind of impact does the distances that you're dealing with, in some of these parts of Australia where it is like 1,300 kilometres and that's considered maybe a shorter distance than some others, like what do you have to do to deal with the distances when medical diagnoses are at play, when emergencies are in the midst? How do you manage just how far you are from being able to help?
You have to make the call when to rush out and pick up a child, or whether that child or that sick person can be managed where they are, and what's the best way of getting help to them. So based in Kalgoorlie, for example, there was Kirikara was the most remote community from Kalgoorlie, and that was about 1,700 road kilometres. So, when I got a call once to do that, it's huge because the pilots have to obviously prepare. So it's not just about hopping on an aircraft. You have to make a decision that says, this aircraft is going to be away from Kalgoorlie, maybe for 8 hours or more. And that means you've got a whole crew. So you've got to speak with the radio operator and make sure that you've got the right information from the community and the nurse that you're dealing with. In 1,700 kilometres away, you've got to get the pilot who has to do a plan in terms of how are they going to have enough fuel, have they got a flight plan, and then the flight nurse is going to speak with you and get all the medication and IV fluids and anything they think is going to be needed. And then you fly out, and that might be 2.5, 2 3/4 hours of a flight for me, in Kalgoorlie, when I was there were pressurised and unpressurised aircraft, and these aren't your commercial aircraft. These are tiny little aircraft that are really cramped and confined. And, you would have to just be hopping in them, and that was noisy. It was hot often, and you'd get dehydrated, and it was a long, long way. There were no toilets on board. So for me, I was very focused on, just make sure you have a wee before you go and don't have too much coffee on the flight. And then, you'd be going out thinking all the time, what's this child doing, what's happening? And you did have some radio communication with the pilot, was able to sometimes speak with a radio operator in Kal who would speak to the nurse in the remote community, and you'd get a little bit of feedback. You knew what was happening. And then it was about looking after and stabilising an unwell child when you reached your destination, and then making the call. So for me, as an example, going out to Kirakara, there was a little baby, a preterm baby born 5 weeks early in the bush under a tree, and the nurse had gone out and collected this poor young mum and her baby and taken them to the clinic. And then we ended up taking this little baby to Alice Springs because that was closer than Perth. And this is where the distances are unbelievable, because people in the city don't always know. So I remember in this case where I had this little preterm baby, I contacted the city doctor, and who asked me for all the results of these investigations and x-rays, and I'm going, we're sitting in a ute with a satellite phone. I don't think there's any x-ray facilities here, mate. So but they don't understand. And then it's like, well, you're in Western Australia, you've got to bring this baby to Perth. And I go, we're an hour from Alice Springs. We're going to Alice Springs. And he said, you can't do that. And I said, well, the pilot's just making a flight plan. We're on our way to Alice. So it's just, you've got to have some common sense. You can't take a sick baby an hour and a half to Alice Springs versus maybe 5 to 6 to 7 hours to get that baby to a tertiary babies hospital in Perth. So I think common sense was a great thing when I was a flying doctor. It wasn't about being, really good or knowing all the answers, but sometimes you just had to make common sense decisions that were for the patient and the safety of the patient, and be brave enough to speak to someone in a city hospital saying, look, I understand what you're saying, but I'm in the bush and we're a long way from Perth. So the right thing to do is to go to Alice Springs, and generally people got that.
And I think you've got to be a very particular kind of person to choose, and to be the right kind of person to be able to do this sort of job. What are the traits you think you've got that set you up to be not only, a sort of successful doctor, but one that could work in remote conditions with kids, with really confronting kind of emergencies that you were coming to?
I think it helped that we had no internet when I did it, so I didn't Google and find out that maybe it was a bit of a brave thing to do at the time. But I think a lot of people who go into jobs don't really know why they do it. They just have a passion to care for people. And for me, I went into it because I had the right set of skills. I'd done some obstetrics, delivering babies. I'd done a lot of work in general practice. I've done psychiatry, pediatrics, some emergency medicine and anaesthetics. And it's a little bit different now because a lot of the doctors that go into flying doctor service would be a lot more qualified than I was on paper back in the late 80s. They've done emergency medicine, physician work and things. But I think overall you've got to just be a very well-rounded doctor and that doesn't mean smarter than other doctors. That was just sometimes being luckier. So for me, I got great training at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and that set me up to be able to do emergency procedures like chest drains and supporting airways and delivering babies if that happened, and looking after young children. But I suppose that for me it was returning to my roots from my days as a child in the Kimberley and the East Kimberley and Wyndham and Kununurra, where my dad was posted as a Bush Church Aid Society Anglican priest, in northwest Australia. And I think that's coming up for 60 years anniversary in Kununurra this year. So that's a fantastic milestone for BCA. And I think that was really my childhood and where I feel my belonging, I think, and where I was first inspired to become a flying doctor, unbeknown to me, sort of 20 years later.
That desire to care for people and show care, was that something you think you inherited from your dad, from your mum? Where did that come from?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? I think that I have such wonderful parents, and I'm so lucky. And, from unbelievable backgrounds. So my dad was very poor. He was in Wollongong. His grandfather was a coal miner. He had a terrible, traumatic childhood. He had no affiliation with the church, but it was a priest who gave Dad a reference to get into the Air Force that changed his life forever. And I think that my dad has been such a humble, kind man. And I think because of his terrible, terrible childhood trauma, the fact that he was so gracious, compassionate, and such an honest, amazing man, and still is, that has to rub off on you, I would hope. That I sort of, not that I aspire to be like my dad, but I can see parallels in his ministry and in my path in medicine. And throughout the time as a young doctor, it was often my dad that I would seek counsel from, whereas my mum, amazing woman, I love her to bits, but she was always a little bit more anxious about things. And so when things were difficult for me, it would be my dad that I would go to, knowing that he would always keep my counsel. And my mum has always been, have another cuppa, put another plate on the table. We had an open door. We had, in vicarages all around Australia, you'd have strays all the time coming in. And it was just expected that that's what you did. And it didn't matter. I think the one thing, I've never felt any, airs and graces about being a doctor. It's like I've almost been embarrassed to call myself a doctor, because I think from my background, we are all equal. And, like when I go to theatre, everyone is equal, believe me, under those seats. When you go into theatre, we're all the same. We're all the same.
Yeah, and everyone's trying to work out how to do their job, the best they can, I suppose. But your parents too, I mean, in the book you describe them a little bit as sort of fire and ice, and you touch on, the upbringings that they had compared to perhaps in some ways how you were raised. Do you think about your parents differently? Like, the older that you've gotten, do you reflect on the way they were, the reasons why they were the way they were, a little bit differently, as you've got some maturity to kind of understand where the anxieties may come from and where the kind of stoicism may have been birthed?
I think you do reflect more as you get older, and I think COVID was a great determinant of all of us thinking about life and where's it headed. And going back in COVID in 2022, I started to talk with my mum and dad, which is when I feel like I learned a lot more about them, because most of us have busy lives, and if you talk to people and say, what did your parents do or your grandparents, not a lot of information is readily available unless you ask, and it's getting the time to ask. So I hadn't appreciated until more recently how difficult it was, particularly for my mum. I think that she's been such an incredible, resilient woman. But now that I'm older, I think, how did she raise 4 children in her time? How did she go to Kununurra with my dad, so far removed from all her family over in Currajong in the Blue Mountains and in Canberra and along the coast of New South Wales? How did she leave that upbringing that she had and go to somewhere like Wyndham and Kununurra that my nana called Hottie Pot? It was so hot. And, that took a lot of resilience. I mean, my mum was 22 when she had me, and I think that my mum was telling me about how when I was born, she and Dad had gone to Yarrabah in far north Queensland with the Anglican Church, and Dad wasn't a priest at that stage. Mum was a teacher. So Mum taught kids to read, and Dad worked in a general store, and a wonderful woman called Ruby, an Aboriginal elder now, she looked after me. And Ruby invited Mum and I back in 2022, and I think that's when it really struck me how incredible my parents were, because, I mean, they were there in Yarrabah during mission time, which a lot of people acknowledge was a very, I suppose, controversial time, stolen generation. But I think, it was what it was at that stage, and I just chose to look at it thinking Ruby's invited us back and she welcomed us back as family, and I'm very grateful that she did that. And it was just, I was in awe when I listened to Ruby speak with Mum, and I really kept a distance because this was not my world. This was their world of hardship, being young people together, and it was different times. And I can't believe that my mum, could have done that and had me. So she was 22. She went to Cairns. If anyone knows what Yarrabah's like, it's sort of, until more recently, it was completely isolated. You had to go by sea to get to Cairns because it's basically cut off by mountains and ocean. And so that was my young mum, who barely knew she was, pregnant, was in Cairns Hospital and by herself, because Dad was at Yarrabah and couldn't get to her easily. And she delivered me and didn't know if I was alive or dead for 48 hours. Wow. And had to ask one of the nursing staff had she had a little boy or a little girl. And it was only recently that she spoke to me about that and about the hardship of having no money. So no money as a young woman, no money when she and Dad were in Gunning in a parish where my dad was on $2,000 a year for a family of 6. And, and that was 71, so that money would be more now. But, that was really tough, and I didn't appreciate that. And I didn't really understand until recently how hard it must have been when our family moved to Melbourne, where I went to high school and then got into medicine, because my parents really sacrificed for me. They moved from Gunning to Melbourne, partly because I was due to go into high school. And then when I was bullied at the local high school so badly, my mum returned to work and to study so that she and Dad could afford to put me through a small private school. And they had no money at all. Like Mum said, some weeks, she said, we had 20 cents left in the bank. And she said, we were really struggling. And I have to take my hat off to her, because without that incredible dedication, I would have never had the education I had. I would never have had a chance to be a doctor. So, I'll always be grateful to my parents for that incredible sacrifice.
There's certainly a generation, I think, in so many ways that just get on with stuff or got on with stuff, and they sort of seem to demonstrate the wherewithal, your parents and many others, to just stick things out and do what needs doing, which I just really respect that. But in mentioning, as you did, your mum, when she had you, 48 hours before she even knew whether you were alive or dead, I think that, or do you think that that's something that plays on another point you raise in No Time for Makeup, is this relationship between patients trusting doctors and doctors having integrity? Do you think it's instances like that perhaps erode some of that dynamic a little bit?
I think at the time the relationship between doctors and patients was different, in the 50s and 60s. But I think now that patient trust, I do think it's eroded quite a bit in some ways, because I think needs are different, but they're greater in some ways now. And it's really important for doctors to walk with a patient and to have the emotional IQ and empathy to understand where a patient's coming from. And this is very relevant to me, having formally stopped my paediatric practice as a registered doctor at the end of last year. Now I'm suddenly, on occasion, a patient, and that's been a little bit of an eye-opener, I must admit. And I sort of look back and think, I'm sure there's things that doctors could have done better in my mum's time, especially around the difficult circumstances of her birth. to explain what was happening, to be more understanding. And I think now doctors also have that responsibility to build that trust between a patient and themselves. And I think that one of the reasons I wrote the book was because of the erosion of the trust between a patient and doctor. I just feel that it's become quite combative, and that really does make me sad at the end of my medical career that somehow doctors haven't worked harder to keep that trust paramount.
And I suppose too, we as the patients, we can Google things and we can, show what we've found and say, isn't this what you should be doing? Which surely that can't make the doctor's job any easier.
I know, look, I don't think it does, but as doctors, we Google as well because I think it doesn't matter in the end. I think it's a working relationship as long as the trust is there, and sometimes it's like, yes, we can Google all these things, but we all know AI, as wonderful as it can be totally wrong because it can get incorrect facts if they're not put in the first place correctly. Yeah, that's probably all I just need to say on that, really.
No, that's okay. And I noted too, of course, in your career, you've spent a lot of time as a pediatrician. You've had a strong focus on kids, caring for kids well, helping kids have the medical care they deserve. Why has that been so important to you?
The paediatric stuff is just, I suppose it's a calling in a way. Like when I was in Kalgoorlie, I was just amazed at how children could get so sick really fast and be at death's door and then recover so quickly. And I just loved the way kids would interact. I think because a child just has such wonderful trust with you. And I think because I'm little, like I'm only about 4'10" and shrinking. And I think that I just feel like because I'm small, maybe that's why I've always kids relate to me, or maybe I've just been a little bit sort of simplistic in the way I approach life and just had such a magical childhood and maybe never left it behind enough. But I think that trust with kids is really, really important. And I just felt moved to be a better doctor when I was in Kalgoorlie, to be able to look after babies and young children. And as I went through the hospital system and did my training, it was 7 years. It was a long time and it was very hard because I was also balancing being a working parent and having two young daughters of my own and working 80 hours a week, looking after newborn babies, being on call and running a private practice. So it was a pretty horrific time. But probably around 2012 in my private practice, there was a very big change in the social climate of the world, and because of it was a time when digital technology really started to explode and we had iPads and things, but it was when I saw as a paediatrician in the community very high levels of anxiety. And so that's been my advocacy really since 2012, is working with complex kids who have anxiety, depression, and children with ADHD and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and children with autism. And I just over time started to do less neonates because I couldn't cope on 2 hours sleep a night getting up to look after babies and then look after my own. That was quite exhausting. So eventually I ended up mainly doing private consulting, and there was such a need within families to support young kids with anxiety and depression, and it's the mental health burden on families and on society has been just incredible and really like a tsunami to me. It's something that we really have to go back to basics and focus our efforts on early childhood, on being kind to one another. Colleagues have got to be kind to each other, communities, neighbourhood. And we have to, I think, just have a bit of a perspective between screens and face-to-face time and just playtime, talking, being with children, being in the present. And I think as a comment, after all the years of paediatrics that I've done, I think the most important thing is that we need to be better at being in the present, so that when you're speaking with someone, that your brain's not going elsewhere and onto a screen or thinking about a movie or what you're going to do for dinner, if you have a child or a teenager who says, Mum or Dad, what do you think about this? You've just got to think, oh my goodness, my child's talking to me and asking me a question. I better hop into the present and answer it. So I think that's really important, that kids need to feel listened to. So that's probably my passion's kept me going, and the feedback from patients, they really have had my back. I mean, there've been times when the emotional vicarious load and burden is just so great. I think, why am I doing this? But I've been overwhelmed by the incredible love from my patients. I really can't believe it. And I didn't think I was making a difference. I was doing my job. And sometimes a young person would say, Dr. Green, you've made a difference. And I think we've all got that. I think, just you don't know what you say that can change a life or change what someone does. So every interaction we have with a person, we will never know the impact of that. And that's what I love about life. It's just that serendipity, I suppose, that, and you sort of think, why on a particular day did I change my routine and meet that person in the supermarket and say something that might have changed that person's life? You just never know. It's quite exciting, all of that, isn't it?
Yeah, it makes it a bit of a thrill. I'm on the same page as you, where it's like you do change a simple habit, or you go a different way to work, whatever it might be. And when something happens, you just feel like, oh, there's a little bit more meaning maybe in that crossing of paths, because it wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Yeah, when I was writing, I was reflecting on my early childhood, and one of the most vivid memories I have is being 5 years old at a Christmas party that was held in Kununurra, and it was run by the Catholic Church, and I was just there as a guest with my dad. And so they were handing out these little prizes or presents for Christmas to all the kids, and I was sitting there thinking, oh, I won't get one because I'm not Catholic and we're just visiting, and so I'm sitting there and I was sort of hoping and thinking, oh, I wish I had something, because you didn't get many presents back then. And anyway, my name was called out, and I just got this beautiful book about Lassie, and it had a white sticker with gold edges, and it was wrapped in brown paper. And it just made me walk so tall that day. I was so excited. And I've never forgotten the way it made me feel that somebody had actually thought about, oh, Elizabeth will be there, she has to have a present as well. So that was just such a lovely thing for me, just those little acts of kindness that stay with you, even when you're old and grey or old and coloured over the grey.
Yeah, it certainly sticks with you. I want to ask you one question, Elizabeth, as we wrap it up. I mean, you have so many beautiful stories, and the book truly is incredible, so I encourage people to check it out. It's called NoTime for Makeup, but there's a quote toward the end. I may fudge it up a little bit, but we'll get the gist, where it says that, better than arriving at your destination is being able to travel hopefully. It stood out to me so much. I kind of loved that attitude. What is it that's kept you hopeful in the journey of your life up to this point?
Well, I think that it's human connection, that it's about the fact that you can make a difference and that you have a responsibility on this earth to be pleasant and to be kind, and curiosity to think that, there's days when I feel, really down like anybody else. But I think, for me personally, I suppose I just think that I just believe in the spirituality of life, and I believe in a God, and I just think that there is hope, and there's hope in the darkness of life, and there's so many horrible things happening at the moment. But I just, like my mum keeps saying and my dad keeps saying, all this will pass and everything will be okay. And I believe that. So I think there's no point. If you're going to live, you may as well live hopefully than live in a dark bubble. But I know for some people, darkness can be really hard and mental ill health can be difficult. And for those people, they do need to have help from professionals. It's fine for bubbly, hopeful people to go along saying, oh, I'm hopeful and things, but I'm really aware of how severe depression is, and it's not just the SADs. I mean, there are people in our community who really can't see hope. And so that's what I'm hopeful for, that perhaps a young doctor or a young psychologist or a young teacher, there's someone listening who might hear what I've said and thought, I can bring some hopefulness to a person in my life. So if that person's you, good luck and bring some hope.
I love Elizabeth's heart for people. You can just tell that she has been a doctor that cares so much for her patients and still cares about people being treated well. Her book is called NoTime for Makeup. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Do share it with a friend. Let me know what you think. You can find me on Instagram at laura.bennett_. And until next time, enjoy living this undistracted life.